to Remembering Allan Holdsworth, Part 3. I'm your host, Eric Miller. This is part of the Pods and Sods Network. And I want to thank you, first off, as always, for clicking the download button or the subscribe button or whatever combination of buttons you've clicked in order to find this episode. It's always very much appreciated. This is Part 3 in a trilogy of tributes and testimonials, folks remembering Allan Holdsworth, his life, his work, his influence, his legacy, his impact. And it's been a real honor for me to get to bring these stories to anybody that's listening. Hopefully you've appreciated it as much as I've enjoyed recording them, and that's been immensely. I took an extra week because I was kind of holding off to get Mr. Satriani. I thought he was worth holding for a week to get him in the can on this. So thankfully we were able to connect, and we got some other awesome folks talking about Allan and his work. So there isn't really much more that I can add in the intro. So without any further ado, remembering Allan Holdsworth. Joining me now is the great Joe Satriani. Welcome, Joe.
Hi, how are you doing today?
Good. Thank you for taking the time to chat with me about Allan Holdsworth. I believe he's kind of an influence on your work, and I certainly want to get into that. But the first thing I've been asking everybody is essentially, how did you first discover Allan Holdsworth's playing?
It was a very unique story that is always so fresh in my mind. That first moment that I heard his guitar playing. I'd have to take you way back to when I was just a beginner. I was maybe 16 years old, let's say.
Cool.
And there was in my neighborhood there was one of my classmates' older brother was a drummer, sort of amateur turning professional.
Right.
And it was a unique moment where he agreed to jam with me for an hour, and it was something that I was trying to get, because I knew even back then that you have to see if you can gain experience playing with older players to push your musicianship forward.
Right.
And it was one afternoon, and I'm down in this guy's basement. You have to imagine basement in Long Island,
right.
New York, and we're playing, and he's playing brilliantly, and I'm just trying to keep up. And he stops at one point, and he looks at me, and he goes, "There's a guy who's doing what you're trying to do." Those were his exact words. I never forget it.
Wow.
There's a guy who's doing what you're trying to do. And I thought, what am I trying to do? What does he mean?
Right.
So he says, "Let me play you this record." And he pulled out Tony Williams' New Lifetime, Believe It. And he puts this record on, and he plays Fred, and I just couldn't believe it. And I was both, shocked and humbled, excited all at once. But I think the most important element that sort of sprung to mind was that my very inexperienced, young and youthful attempt at legato was validated by hearing this virtuoso, Allan Holdsworth, actually do it. I mean, he really did it. On that record, when I heard, a virtuoso player playing an SG into a Marshall with a small stone phase shifter, and yet he's playing this, it sounded like rock, but the notes, of course, were like Coltrane. And so that pushed both those buttons that I loved. I was a rock and roll kid, and I loved both rock and jazz. And so all of a sudden it was like, wow, you can actually do it, because this guy's actually accomplished it. Mm-hmm. And he was playing more notes than I'd ever heard anybody play, and yet I couldn't hear the pick. It wasn't this constant chop, chop, chop. which a lot of players were using when they wanted to play fast. It was like, in my view, it was almost like somebody pronouncing every word the same way that they pronounce one word. You know what I mean?
Right.
And it's sort of like imagine when you say the word cake. There's in English there's a lot of consonants going into that, the consonant sound going into that, hard consonants. And imagine if you want to say something, a full sentence that has nothing to do with cake, but for some reason the sound of cake is in front of every word. It makes no sense, does it? You'd call that an impediment, right?
Right.
If you were trying to do a voiceover, or if you're an actor or a speaker. And so I wonder, why are musicians like that? Why would a guitar player play every note the same way, totally disregarding the subject matter of the song or the feeling behind the song or the emotion of the moment? I didn't hear jazz horn players do that. They played everything specifically. Technique was specific. And, of course, classical musicians train their whole lives to be specific. And so why was there this group of shredders out there? That was before they used that word shredder. But why were they out there simply chomping away at the guitar strings like they were chopping wood? And so I heard Allan, and, the clouds parted and a ray of sunshine came down from the heavens, and I thought, this guy is a god. He has figured it out, and that stayed with me, and I became kind of like a disciple, not necessarily of everything that he did, but the fact that he did it, and the fact that he struck out on his own and maintained this quality of originality for his whole career.
Yeah. So as a young player, when you first hear this and the way you describe that, it's a bit of an awakening, or realization that it's not only possible but it's happening. Is that a game changer? How do you adjust to that? And it's also an interesting time, I assume, because it's way before YouTube, so you have no sense of seeing how he's doing what he's doing. You just kind of have to rely on your ear, and I guess what you can pick up in magazines and stuff. What was the next step in discovering the path that Allan was blazing, if you will?
Oh, the next step was seeing him in concert, and there was a small club on Long Island called My Father's Place, held just a few hundred people, right. But that would be the kind of place that a fusion group would have played at the time. Right. That was trying to make a name for themselves, and it was just a few miles from where I was growing up. So I did get to see that tour. Tony Williams and Alan Pasqua and Allan Holdsworth. I forget the bass player's name right now. And it was incredible. The stage was very small. They were all spread out left to right. There was no room for, drums in the back and players in front, kind of thing. Allan was playing through a full stack, but he had each cabinet separate. One of them was turned to the wall, actually. But there he was. He was playing the 3-pickup white SG, and he did have the small stone phase shifter as his only effect. It was so raw. I mean, I don't know if people remember what that would sound like if you were in a club and you were 6 feet away from somebody playing through a Marshall stack with, no delays, no compressors, no digital reverbs,
Right.
It was so raw, but it was so impressive. I was entranced by what he was able to accomplish with the rudest of guitar setups. I mean, that would frighten me if I had to do a gig with that setup. But he kept the guitar in tune. He played appropriately. I didn't hear any mistakes. I saw him reach for, the stars and grab them.
Wow.
I witnessed them improvising because they had, only one album's worth of material to draw upon, so they were stretching songs out. And Tony was, highly improvisatory, in his approach. So it was a beautiful evening for a young musician to be able to witness without any fanfare. No projections, no light show. There must have been only 30 people who attended the show. It must have looked pretty bleak to them,
right.
But to those of us in the audience, it was one of the most special nights ever.
Yeah.
Didn't see him again for I don't know, 12 years later, I don't think.
Wow.
I didn't catch him until he came through Berkeley, California, where I was living in the early 80s in support of I.O.U.
Right. And at that point, that band, the I.O.U. band, is when he had a vocalist. Do you remember any difference in seeing this guy now with vocals? That was sort of a different era for him.
Well, I had lots of impressions of it. I mean, first of all, you have to understand that since I was a young kid, it was normal for me to listen to vocal music but never pay attention to the vocal part.
Right.
I was always so into the musical part. I was recently going over an addition to my biography that's going into paperback in a few months, and we added one more chapter to update it. And in there was a story, an interview that I had given about a song called Scarborough Stomp, and I told the same story where I had been listening to this Scarborough Affair by Simon and Garfunkel since I was a little kid, but I never paid any attention to the words.
Right.
I just loved the music, and I love the intricacy of the music and the scale of it. And then, years later, decades later, I learned the whole story behind what it is they're singing about and everything. And so, yeah, when I.O.U. came together and there's vocals, I just took it in as it was part of the musical message.
Right.
There was a part of me that, by then I'm a professional musician, right? I'm working. And I started thinking, oh, that poor singer. How could anybody sing over such complexity?
Right.
Like, usually a singer wants to know what's my first note, But Allan, of course, gives you every note all the time. And so I just kept thinking, this poor guy, he's got to sit there and sing. Meanwhile, when he looks out into the audience, all he sees is guitar players who are just staring at Allan going, oh my God,
Yeah.
Hardest job, every once in a while, the hardest job in show business shows up. And that was it. At that moment in time, that was it.
Wow.
So yeah, there was empathy and sympathy that I had. But I thought it was. I didn't mind it. As a matter of fact, I did. When they came to Berkeley, to the Berkeley Keystone Club to play, I brought my drummer from the band I was in called the Squares. We were like a power pop band, kind of like Green Day-ish kind of sounding band. And my drummer, Jeff Campitelli, was not into fusion or jazz at all. He was strict like rock and roll or early jazz, pre World War II kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So he was sort of kicking and screaming. I dragged him to the show, and I said, "You have to just witness it." And he hated the vocals. He just thought, "I just want to hear what the guy's doing." He was curious about the Gary Husband's approach, but he fell asleep during the show. And meanwhile, I was riveted the whole time,
right?
Because to me, the complexity of Allan's harmony and his voice leading was just the most modern thing I'd ever heard in my life. I mean, and it still remains untouched. I mean, it's unbelievable what he accomplished, and I know in the future people will look back on it and they'll say, "Oh my God, how did I miss it? This is such a huge leap forward in the development of music."
Yeah. Did you now at that point, like, had you met him yet, or when did you officially first meet him?
No, I didn't get to meet him until, I'm gonna guess, 86, 87.
Okay.
I got signed to Relativity Records
Right.
by way of Cliff Coltrari, who was sort of president of R&D and A&R, R&D, A&R, excuse me,
Right. Right.
at the label. It's funny when I think about, when I mention Cliff's name, he's such a dear friend. I talk to him every week. It's hard to think of him as a guy with a job and a title, because I always saw him as a fellow guitar player, friend, and musical enthusiast. But that he did have a real job at the time, and he was great at it. And because he not only did he sign Steve I, but he signed me, and he signed Allan as well. And so he started helping Allan, sort of get his life together at the time. And it's not unusual with musicians like that trying something so difficult and unique, that the business side is a bit in shambles. And so Cliff was good with helping talented musicians sort of interface with the world of record company, touring, getting a band together, find a rehearsal space, develop a plan, go out on tour, that kind of thing. He was and still is to a large degree the ultimate A&R guy, and because he was a crazy guitar player himself, he totally got it. He just understood what we were trying to do. That was the first couple of times I met Allan, and I can't say that I ever really got close enough to him, because I found Allan somewhat unreachable. Like he seemed very troubled most of the time, or at least that's how he expressed himself. To me as being troubled, and so it was hard for me to sort of to figure out the basis of our friendship,
Right.
Because there was always so much turmoil going on, and he was never in the same place at this more than once, and so I didn't see him again. It was a good number of years. Oh wow, let me think about that. I never thought about this. Almost 15 or something years, and then before he visited a show, I was on tour with Eric Johnson. I think it was the Super Colossal tour, perhaps, and he came down to the show in Anaheim, which is the last time I was like physically hanging out with him, talking with him,
Right.
But he seemed to be in good spirits that night. I have to say, I was very happy. I mean, I really felt joy after that night, because he seemed to be smiling and happy, and he wasn't in his usual sort of,
That's
sour
interesting.
mood.
That's interesting, because it's is the difference that he's on stage or not on stage? Could that be a difference that feeds into that?
I don't know. Yeah, maybe because he wasn't playing that night. Maybe because he was just happy to see Eric and I on tour doing what we do.
Right.
And we Eric and I gushed over him. It was probably so obvious that we were total fans and revered him, totally. So, and we, and knowing that he was there, I think made us try extra hard to be good that night.
That's funny.
Just for him.
All right. There is, I don't know that you guys ever professionally worked together, but there is a Stu Ham song that you're both on. Did you ever play with them? I'm assuming that song was more kind of a studio assembly effort.
Yeah, I think we never played together. We never even got a chance. Although when, back in 95, I started putting the G3 concert series together, and it took a year for me to convince everybody in the business that it was a good thing, and that lead guitar players should in fact stand next to each other to buck industry standards and practices. I said, no, the audience really does want to see people that you might view as competitors standing next to each other playing.
Right.
And one of the guys that I wanted to bring out was Allan Holdsworth, and there was some resistance there because as a curator of the show, I had to sell it to local promoters around the country. That's sort of like my problem, right? I dream up a great concert, but then actually we can't play anywhere unless somebody buys the show,
Of course.
So I'd have to sell it. And so when I would bring up Allan's name, everyone would say, "Oh, that guy's a genius." However, they much rather I would have said Slash is coming, right?
Right.
Because they just want to sell tickets, right? So there was that sort of resistance I was getting, but I do remember that because of where he was, the other offers that he was juggling at the time, we weren't able to offer him what he felt he should be getting, either time on stage, because at the time we started, everybody played 45 minutes, and I think he thought he needed longer to do his show.
Right.
And so I think at the time, whoever was managing him, I guess he felt that it would be better if he just did his own shows. And I was I was so sad because I thought, he would elevate the musicality of the show to such an incredible level. And quite selfishly, I thought I would get to see him like 30 nights in a row.
Wow, right?
I'd get to sit on the side of the stage and hang out during the day, and it was just a crazy dream, But so that never came to fruition. So I didn't see him again until that one night when Eric and I just happened to be on tour together, and he kind of showed up.
Yeah. How about just sort of two final questions? How about stylistically? You mentioned legato, obviously. Does he still inform your playing? Does that discovery as a kid, do you carry that with you? How is he influencing you now, all these years in, if at all?
Yeah, well, definitely. I think every time I, launch into something heavily legato, two things come to mind is that I'm grateful for that inspiration,
Right.
that he brought to my musicianship. And I'm careful not to copy what he did. Not that I could.
Right.
I suppose that's the third thing. The third thing is I'm reminded how I'll never be as good as that. Just never. Because you think about it, I started trying to do what he was doing, when I was 15 years old. And so now at age 60, I suppose the reality sets in that's probably not going to happen. But you develop you pick up interesting things from positive role models in music, and then you say, how can I use this in an original way? How can I use it without bringing to light my shortcomings? So like a vocalist who, is in love with Mariah Carey's range, but realizes they can't sing that high.
Right.
So what do? They change the melody line in their song so it doesn't reveal the fact that their voice is going to crack if they try to hit the high C that Mariah can hit.
Right.
I think we all have to deal with. Every musician is, got pluses and minuses in their technique, and there's no point showing the audience what you can't do.
Right.
I'm reminded of that. I mean, I just finished recording a record, and during the weeks where I was doing the overdubs, playing melodies and solos, Allan passed away. So it was like, really, he was on my mind quite a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. My sort of final question is that I've been asking everybody is essentially, what would you hope the legacy of Allan Holdsworth would be in the future going forward?
I would hope that people would listen to the intense beauty of his music. It's a good thing that they would recognize his technical brilliance and the fact that he was an innovator. But technique is something that it comes and goes because it gets absorbed so quickly into the musician's vernacular. It just becomes absorbed. It's like Eddie Van Halen's tapping. You know what I mean? It's like if it's good and it works, everybody learns it in a second, and then it's no longer unique. So and as a guitar player, I was well aware of how unique and innovative his technique was. But to me, his musicianship, his musical voice, his use of melody and harmony was and still is completely unique. There's nobody like it. There's no one who writes a melody like that. No one who imagines and succeeds at harmonizing melodic lines like Allan. It is truly a beautiful work of art. When you look at the body of his work, it's pretty stunning. I wish it had been celebrated, while he was alive, because that success would have given him time to explore more of his art instead of struggling to get gigs, to pay the rent.
Right.
It's not an unusual story for unique artists. The one that we're all familiar with is the painter that is completely misunderstood, and they die penniless, and then all of a sudden their artwork sells for $80 million.
Yeah.
Or a little, double-A size painting or something. It's like, well, that really would have helped while the guy was alive. So there are so many brilliant men and women out there making incredible music, but people don't realize it, and so it becomes unheralded as it's or underappreciated.
Yeah.
So that's what I would always hope, is that people would go back and they'd listen to it, and even the little things like he does this and the guitar solo for the song Red Alert, which is on the Believe It record. The way that starts and how that develops, to me, is still a work of art, and that says so much about Allan and his personality, his musical yearning, and it was expressed in such a bare bones way. It's just the drums, the bass guitar doing simple bass line, a couple of keyboard chords behind him, and he just creates a piece of music where other people would just do a guitar solo. You know what I mean? And it's just so unique. It's so beautiful. I think I'm hopeful that in the future that his legend will grow for the right reasons.
joining me now is the great Frank Gambali. Welcome, Frank.
Hey, how you doing?
Doing well. Thank you for taking some time out of your busy schedule, I'm sure, to chat about Mr. Allan Holdsworth. I know you guys were colleagues and friends, I would assume, and kind of danced around each other in professional terms. But the first, and I do want to ask a lot about that, particularly the record you guys did together, but kind of going back to the beginning, how did Allan first get on your radar? How did you first discover his music?
Yeah, well, Eric, the first time I heard him was on an album by Jean-Luc Ponty called Enigmatic Ocean.
Nice.
And it hit me like a bolt of lightning, actually, when I first heard him. Because up until that point, I think I was about 16. That record came out around 76, I think.
Right.
And it's the opening track. There's a track where there's some trades that goes on. Jean-Luc plays violin, and then there's another guitar player, Daryl Stuermer, who plays in a more traditional way. And then Allan comes in. And when Allan comes in, it's like the clouds parting and the angels start to sing. It was just magical. The tone, the presence, the uniqueness, the harmonic content of what he played, it was just knocked my face off, really. I mean, literally, as a 16-year-old, listening to this, I'd never heard the guitar play that way. And there was a lot of things I got from that. One of the things was, here's a guy who comes along that he doesn't sound like anybody. He's utterly unique. In fact, at first I didn't even know it was guitar. It was so different. And it made me realize and appreciate him in such a high regard because he was utterly unique. And I realized how difficult that is when you consider how many guitar players there are on the planet. To have a singular voice and recognizable instantly is really hard thing to achieve. And then I sort of tried to emulate it in some way, but I had absolutely, I grew up in Canberra in Australia. I mean, it's the capital of Australia. It's a little country town and a long way from what was happening in LA,
Right.
I had absolutely no idea how he was doing what he was doing. So after a couple of, feeble attempts, I just went, I'm going to put this fine fellow in a category that I call inimitable. Someone who cannot be imitated. Right. Or at least I could. People have tried, and some people have come sort of close. But, he was so unique in every regard. I just couldn't do anything like it. So but the good thing I got out of it was that I realized that to have that kind of an impact, you really have to have your own thoroughly different and thoroughly unique approach to the instrument. And that really motivated me to pursue the sweep thing further,
Right.
Before I unleashed my thing onto the world. But Allan, he was such a great musician, such a misunderstood and, over the top of the heads of most mere mortals,
Right. Right.
Both harmonically and, it's not just his linear approach, it's also his harmonic content is incredibly rich harmonically,
How did you, coming out of Australia and as you're pursuing your career, at some point your paths cross, what was the first time? Did you see him live? Did you just meet him? How did you guys eventually connect?
I'll tell you the story, and it was when I first, I auditioned for Chick Corea's band in the summer of '86.
Okay.
And the electric band at that time didn't have a horn player. It was just a quartet. And when I came in, I was unknown, really. And the first tour we did was a U.S. tour. We did about 30 or 40 concerts around the U.S. And Allan Holdsworth Trio with Jimmy Johnson and Chad Wackerman opened for us for a good 20 of those shows, or 25 of those shows. So here's this kid, an unknown, having to go on after Allan every night with a trial by fire.
That's great.
So it was a challenge for me to do my thing and to try to hold my own.
Right.
But it was wonderful hearing Allan every night, and I was always on the wings of the stage, checking him out every night, just going, wow, what a monster,
Right.
The funny thing is, he would come off stage every night, and one of his famous quotes is, "I'm sorry you had to hear that."
Right.
It's so absurd. After you hear what you hear, and then he comes off so down on himself. I'm going, what? I don't understand. Those two don't match,
Right.
What he plays and what he says about his playing are two diametrically opposed things. So, after about the fifth night, we would all start to join in and say, yeah, man, that was horrible. What do you think? What do you think playing that rubbish, And then he started to laugh, and it broke the ice. And, I got to know him pretty well on that tour. And then later, the Truth and Shredding record, the opportunity to play together, I was quite nervous about that too, because I don't like it when, when you make these records with a bunch of guitar players on it, everybody turns it into a contest, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And it's art, it's not sport. You can't compare. This guy's faster than that, and that guy plays more, it's insanity. It's art, right? And so I was signed to a small label called Legato Records, and it was Mike Varney's brother, Mark Varney, who headed the label.
Right.
And it was his dream to put his two favorite guitar players together on a record, and that was Allan Holdsworth and me. And I'd already done 3 records for him, so I was he asked me to produce it and choose the material, and so I, to play. We didn't actually play. I recorded the album live with the band, and then we left space for Allan. Allan, because he didn't read music in the traditional sense.
Right.
He felt a little at a disadvantage coming in and playing kind of songs that are way out of his usual radar. So, we had no problem with that. We left space for him, and then he filled in his solos in his studio in his own time.
Right.
And then we got to mix together, which was a lot of fun.
Was he really particular in that? Because one of the things about him is, that I've gleaned from these conversations is, he was essentially never really happy with what he played, after the fact. And you indicated as well. So, he records something and then you're mixing it. Was it more of that where he was like, was he down on his material? Was he sort of psyched by the project? Do you remember his any of that?
I remember that he didn't really say anything bad about his playing because he really couldn't.
Right.
His playing was stellar on that record, and so he was more. I think the emphasis went from his performance to his sound.
Gotcha.
So he would bring all his 40 EQing stuff, state of the art gear. He was a tweak head, he would sit there and tweak his sound for hours, until he got it just right. So he was a gear nut,
All right.
He was quite happy to modify things and pull them open and get inside them and see how they tick. And he knew how to use them too. He was very proficient in the studio.
Awesome. So at that point, you're well established. Is there still any lingering, like, fanboy? Like, did you still ask him, technical questions, or, boy, how did you do this? Like, or was he more of a contemporary at that point?
Well, I remember being about a foot away from his hands, with my head just getting in there and having a look at his hands as he was doing it. And this doesn't compute. It doesn't. I can't make any sense of what he's doing. I sort of get the general idea, but it was just the way his hands were so huge. They would just crawl all over the fretboard, and he picked like one note in 10, and I just didn't know how this sound and this momentum happened with his linear approach. It was quite spectacular. So being that close didn't really help. I was absolutely convinced at that point that I could, there's no way that decision I made as a kid that he was inimitable stood the test of time. And, but, I also was blown away by his chordal approach, because he would sit there and just play a series, a chord sequence, chord melody kind of thing. Right. And the way his right hand would grab the most peculiar combinations of strings. Like he would pick the low 2 strings and maybe the high 2 strings together. But, I mean, it kept morphing. It kept all these different combinations of the 6 strings with his right hand. Mm-hmm. And that was quite remarkable to me because not only did it sound like a keyboard, and his voicings were so unconventional, so wide. It was really that technique, to me, paralleled. It was on the same level as his linear approach. So, not everybody talks about his chordal magic, but it was really as impressive as his linear approach to me.
Yeah, amazing. And he, you said to the point that, he was an artist, that exploration never seemed to cease for him.
No. Yeah, he was largely misunderstood by the general public. I know people would go to see him and they'd be scratching their heads going, I don't get it, but that's too bad. Those that did get it, got it deeply. And it was very, it was like looking at an Einstein equation on a blackboard. Not many people are going to get it,
Right.
Very few, many. And that's where he was,
That's a great
metaphor. He was.
That's a great metaphor. I guess kind of a sort of a closing question, if you will, is, and you're kind of speaking to it already, would be, in terms of his legacy, maybe within the guitar community, right? You say he's sort of otherworldly. How do you see the body of Allan Holdsworth, his work, moving forward?
Well, he was quite prolific, really. He did do a lot of recording, and we're graced by that. And he will always be this bar, and he will be remembered, as a key figure in the history, the lexicon, the guitar techniques, as well as his musicality. He was one of a kind. His music was varied and interesting and on a very, very high harmonic and musical level. I think in the future, people will understand and appreciate his music even more, I think, moving forward, It's not as understood well enough now as it could be in the future when people, really take a listen and when we catch up a little bit,
Right. It sounds like he put a real creative stake in the ground, right? So guitar players for generations, are always going to be looking at that stake, that milestone.
Yeah. I mean, that's his legacy, his recordings, that's what we have in this video. And, he's been largely imitated. A lot of people have copied or tried to copy his linear approach. Very few have even come close to his chordal approach or his harmonic approach. And so, he's one of these incredible sparks. I hate talking about him in the past tense. I just saw him at NAMM, gave him a big hug. I was always one to tell him how brilliant he was, and I remember even years ago writing to him, and I felt compelled to have to tell him as one of his, considered one of his peers anyway, because our names always get bandied around together often. And I had to let him know from a very personal level. I wrote him a very long letter, just in absolute praise of what he had accomplished, what he had achieved on the instrument, his uniqueness, his genius, and that I, for one, and there are many, that really appreciated and understood and praised him for what he had achieved on the instrument. And I just felt the need to make sure every time I saw him that point got across.
Yeah.
Because, it's an unkind world to be that far off on a limb on his own. And he has been for years, and that's a lonely place, really,
Yeah.
It's a lonely place to be that gifted and that misunderstood, and or not in the pop. It's not pop music by any stretch of the imagination. So it's very difficult for most people to consume as music.
Right.
But it's guitar music on the absolute peak. On his mountain, he was at the peak, and that was his own mountain that he was on. And it's much harder to lead than it is to follow. People have taken what they want from his genius. They'll adapt it into other forms, perhaps in a more popular way. But there's no denying that a lot of people have been influenced by him, and he helped spark a lot of other approaches to the instrument.
Joining me now is the great Steve Hunt. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks. It's nice to be here talking with you.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time to chat about your friend and colleague, Mr. Allan Holdsworth. You spent a lot of years with him, on and off the road, I suppose. And I want to ask some specific questions about that. The thing that I've been asking people kind of in the beginning is, how did you first discover Allan? Before you met him, I'm assuming you had an awareness of his work and.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess the first time I actually heard Allan's playing was on the Bill Bruford records. I was this is around 1978 or 79, and I was attending Berkeley,
right.
And I was in one of the friends' dorm room or something, and they put on the record, and it was when Allan first came in on that first track, and it was just, and a lot of people have had that same experience. They're like, who is this, and what is he doing,
Right.
And it seems like everybody had that same reaction every time they said. The first time I heard him, I was like, and so it was no different for me at that time, and so that was my first introduction probably to him, and then I went back and heard him on UK and of course Tony Williams and stuff, mm-hmm. And but really when the thing that really just like struck me the most was I was doing this gig out in upstate New York, and then this friend of mine gave me a cassette tape. He said, "Oh, check this out," and it was Allan's first record, the I.O.U. record he did,
right.
And I think that was around the same time, maybe around 1980 or something, or 81,
right.
And I drove all the way back from upstate New York back to Boston, and that's the only thing I listened to the whole 3.5 hour drive. And I remember when I got out of the car, to come in, my knees were just shaking, and I was like, I can't believe this is what humans can write music like this and solo like this and play like that. It was just totally blown away, So then at that point, I just became a huge fan, and was struck by his chord voicings, and as a pianist, I kind of related to them more than most other guitar players that were around at the time, but they seem more like keyboard voicings to me, and
right.
And it's something I was more attracted to, for a guitar player. So it wasn't really like the instrument or whatever, but it was basically those voicings and it really struck me. So I really, started listening to him a lot from that point, and then after that, my band actually opened up for him once in Salem, Massachusetts,
nice.
And I had a group here in Boston, and we actually were the opening act, and he didn't get to hear me play because they were stuck in traffic and they got there late and stuff, and but I was just mesmerized, and I remember after the gig, he was standing, I don't know, maybe 10 feet from me. I didn't even have the nerve to actually go up and talk to him. I was like, just it was like, this is Allan Holdsworth, and already a god to me back. This is probably right after they did the Mental Fatigue album, and so I had no idea that in a few years I'd actually be in his band playing with him.
Amazing.
But the way I actually met him was a few years later. I wound up playing through a series of events. I wound up playing in Stanley Clark's band, and Stanley had called me one summer. This is the summer of the spring of '87, and he said, "Oh, we're going to do this tour this summer, and it's 10 weeks long." And I just had a new baby, and I was like, I don't know if I can do 10 weeks, 2.5 months on the road, away from the family.
Right.
And then he said, "Oh, by the way, Allan Holdsworth band is opening up for us on the whole tour." And I was like, it didn't take me 1 second. I said, "Oh yeah, I can definitely do that tour, no problem." And
that's awesome.
And so, and I was like, I did, and then I told my wife, "Oh, by the way, I'm leaving for 2.5 months." And but Allan Holdsworth is on the tour, so you have to forgive me. So I on that tour where I first met him, and it was just happenstance. It just happened that they were playing. He was using a syntax that time, and they were using a backing track, and they really hated it because like Chad had to play to a tambourine click track, and they couldn't extend the choruses because it was when Allan would take the synth solo, these synth chords would come in on the cassette tape, and they really hit. So after the first week, all my keyboard stuff was set up, and he said, "Hey, why don't you just join us on these songs so we don't have to use that bleeping cassette tape, you know?" And
Wow.
I said, "Okay." So he wrote out some changes, and then so I started playing during his set, maybe 3 or 4 songs, and we hung out a lot during the time. And then about halfway the tour, he just said, he goes, "Oh, I got a tour coming up this fall. You know, would you like to join us?" You know.
Wow.
And
Wow.
that was the point. And I was just, you know, so it was everything was sort of, I was just in the right place, right time, kind of luck, you know. But that's how I first met him, and how I actually wound up being in his band, you know. And but a friend of mine, a guitar player here in Boston, Bruce Bartlett, we used to listen to Allan's music all the time and play. And he knew I was going on this tour and I was going to meet Allan, so I just sent him a postcard when Allan asked me that. Next day I got a postcard, and then on the back of it I wrote, "I got the gig." That's all I put. And I think he still has that postcard up on his wall, you know. And it was a big moment. And you know, I was in my 20s, and you know, it was like it was just like a dream come true. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
And, it was a beautiful experience, you know. So, and I think the fact that he was a big synthesizer guy. I had DX7s and Oberheims. I had all the stuff, and I think he liked that. He loved that sound as well. So
let me ask you.
He just, you know, we just kind of put together. Yeah.
Yeah, let me ask you sort of a question or two through all of that. So, you know, the first one is, you know, when you said you listened to I.O.U. as a kid on that road trip, right, and it just hooked your ear, or the Bruford record. Yeah. Is it a technical thing that hooks your ear, or is it an emotional thing? Do you remember? Like, what about it was that made you just say, "Holy shit! Now my world is different"? Was it a combination of those two things?
Yeah, I mean, you can't get away from Allan's facility, his technical facility on that instrument, and
right.
That kind of. But I think, I mean, as a pianist, is like that. Now on guitar, I think during that time it was sort of kind of a relatively new thing on guitar to have that kind of facility and technique. Right. Nowadays, you know, it's pretty common. But on piano, I mean, you go back to the days of Liszt and Chopin. That kind of technical facility on the piano was kind of commonplace, you know. So that was one thing. But I think it was mostly these type of harmonic changes during the solos, right, that really touched me. It's like the way that his harmony moves, and because my dad was a jazz bebop sax player, and in that world, your harmonic structures are based around key centers, and they're, you know, you're in the key of B flat or you're in the key of E flat, and you have progressions within the key, and they move different places. But here was something that seemed to have no basis in a certain key, and the harmony just move, you know, for the sake of colors or expression. And that's what really brought me to it, like, you know, how, you know, and when I joined the band and when I started learning the music, I realized that playing over those kind of things was much easier for me than playing over, say, Stella by Starlight or any kind of 2-5-1, which I always struggled with. I still do to this day, you know. But for some reason, the way Allan's chords move harmonically, I kind of, there's something that I feel at home with, you know. It's not that they're easy. It's just, right. It's just I feel that, you know, it kind of makes sense the way it moves and the way melodic lines work over it, you know. So I think, I think it was, you know, it's more emotional attachment to like the harmony and the way the harmony moved, you know. Right. And of course, his ability on the guitar itself is just, of course, like it wasn't like, especially at that time, was like no one else, you know. But, yeah. So I told him one time, I think he really appreciated it. One time I told him, I said, you know what I like about like you and your music the most is your melodies. And he kind of piped up and he was like, oh, and he really appreciated it. And I realized that I think he kind of sees most people think they, or, you know, like a lot of people think, he thought a lot of people liked him because he played fast, or he was technical, like, wow, you play so fast and you play crazy notes, and
Right.
But it was like his melodies and the way he thinks of melodic ideas is like really struck me. So anyway.
Beautiful. So when you're finally in his band, you sort of describe, being a fan, and then, your friend's postcard and, neglecting your new baby and whatnot. But
yeah.
So is there there has to be a point where, the fanboy starts to fade and the friendship builds, or did you kind of just remain a fanboy? Like, did you ask him technical questions? How was that relationship?
Yeah, this was, well, yeah, I mean, on that particular tour, we kind of, as far as like, we started hanging out a lot on that particular Stanley Clarke tour, and and we became pretty good friends. I would say, just during that time, we were gone a long time. It was kind of hard for Allan to on, and I think out of everybody on the tour, I think it was just me and Allan that our wives or girlfriend didn't join.
Right.
So we were like the two lonely guys on the whole 2.5 month tour.
Right.
And so we hung a lot, and I would hang with them at the bar after the gigs, and we just, I mean, everybody that ever talks to Allan, they meet him one time and they say, oh my good friend Allan, he just had that kind of personality. But
Nice.
but we sort of had some nice things in common, and we talked about a lot of stuff, and I would try to talk to him about musical kind of things, but most of the time we just talked about either beer or bikes.
Right.
He was a cyclist.
Right.
Or women, girls, or and eventually every once in a while I'd get him to talk about a scale or a chord, but he wasn't so interested, on the off time to talk about that,
Right.
If we were in rehearsal or on the gig, his mind was 150% music, it was all things. But when he was away from that, it was about other stuff, and
Right.
things he liked, and just different things. So
Nice.
I think I was always, to this day, and even after I left the band in 1996 or something like that, I go see every show that he came, just like I did before I was in the band. Every time he'd come to Boston or New York, I'd go see every show. So I went from being a fanboy to like a member of the band, and then back to being a fanboy.
Right.
I just love the stuff,
joining me now is the great Jean-Luc Ponty. Welcome, Jean-Luc.
Hello. Nice to talk to you.
Thank you for taking the time to talk with me about, I'm assuming your longtime friend Allan Holdsworth. I know you worked together through the years, and I think you're preparing for a tour, so I'm sure you don't have a ton of time, so I appreciate you taking some time out. The first thing I like to ask everybody about Allan Holdsworth is basically how did you and Allan connect? I think you and he were pretty early on, maybe just as he was going solo. How did you guys first connect?
Well, I had played as a trio with Tony Williams, with a drummer. Maybe we should explain for younger generations who might not have heard of Tony Williams. He was a big revolution in jazz drumming. He was hired by Miles Davis at 17 years old, and as soon as we heard him play, it was unbelievable.
Right.
Big revolution.
Yeah.
And after he left Miles, he founded his own band called Lifetime. He discovered John McLaughlin, brought him to the U.S., and I played with Tony as a trio and Clark in Europe. And a few years later, I had lost track. I mean, I was doing my own, following my own path, and I saw that he had a new album that came out called $1 Million Leg, I think, or...
Right.
Is that the right title? I forgot, but anyway. I bought it by curiosity to hear what, where Tony was up to. And that was a big shock. One of the biggest musical shocks I had was to discover Allan's playing on it. And the sound, how lyrical it was, how emotional, how inventive, and totally new.
Right.
And at the time, I had started my own band, and I was auditioning guitar players, and I would say practically all the young guitarists were trying to play like McLaughlin. I mean, McLaughlin was the big inspiration at that time,
Right.
at least for guys who were into jazz rock, and fusion.
Right.
Like the type of guy I needed in my band. But after Allan was discovered, they tried to play like Allan, but nobody could really.
Right.
In fact, so anyway, I was so impressed, and while I was discovering his playing on this album, I was writing music for my new album at the time, which was Enigmatic Ocean,
Right.
in 1977.
Right.
And as I was writing a couple of pieces that were very lyrical, with beautiful melodies, and I was hearing him play on it. I thought he would fit on that type of style. So I remember I was touring in Europe, and we played in London. I called him up, and he came to the show. We met, and he accepted to come to Los Angeles to record on my album,
Wow.
Enigmatic. So that was the first collaboration.
Wow.
And
Can I ask?
I couldn't believe he could not. Yeah.
Can I ask about that? So you said you were writing songs, and you heard that he might be the perfect player for that. Were you composing with him in mind, or more, and then when you get in
I
get
had the piece. No, it's more after the piece was written.
right,
That I was hearing. I thought he would be the perfect
right,
guitarist on this type of particular piece, and I happened to be right.
right, of course,
I happened to be right because that was really. I mean, that's where we had a connection. And when I invited him to play again, to collaborate on a couple of more albums, and the last time was on my last studio album, which was in 2007.
right,
And same thing. I mean, when I heard his solo on that particular piece, where I thought that would fit his style, it brought tears, you know. It was so emotional when I heard that. Unbelievable. It was just unique.
Wow. So you have these compositions, and you invite him to play. Is there room for him to experiment? Like, how did he fit into what you were working on?
Well, I mean, it's not like the piece was finished, written,
right.
So he was really. I just had to play on it, to perform the piece as it was, and learn it, learn the melodies, but and find his way through the chord changes. But he did, for sure. But what killed me when he first collaborated on Enigmatic Ocean is that I realized not only he could not read music, but so I was trying to teach him the melody, like in Enigmatic Ocean, and saying it starts with I forgot a G, maybe just I named the note, and he couldn't even find it on the guitar. I didn't even know where a G or an A was on the guitar.
Wow.
And so I played it on the violin. I would play each note, and he would hear it and find it on the neck on the guitar. And I couldn't believe that after that, once he had absorbed and understood and learned the melody, all the notes, then he was wailing on it, and the sound was I remember I was playing the melody on the violin and hearing him play at the same time, and hear that guitar sound with my melody on the violin was unreal.
Right.
It was just fantastic.
Amazing.
But he was very, he was like, I would say, the top musicians in each instrument. We were all very demanding for our sound, and he was as well, I could tell. And he even made his own devices at the time. I forgot what he had. It was a small preamp, but he was good at that as well.
Right. Now he
knew what he wanted. You know, what the sound he had in the studio, for sure.
Of course. It's funny that you say that he couldn't read music, because you know, one of the things that about Allan that stands apart is, you know, he had a really great and unique mind for music, almost like an instinctive understanding beyond, you know, a normal sort of classic rock guitarist kind of understanding. So it's funny that you say that, because, you know, it makes you wonder, you know, where that comes from. It just seems to have been a gift.
Well, it proves that music, you have the talent or you don't, and then if you learn to read notes, I would say that the background helps to. It was a help for me. I mean, I had a totally different upbringing musically, with parents who were music teachers, so I knew how to read music before I could read the alphabet, perhaps. And I would say the advantage of that was that I could adapt to different styles of music, of bands. You know, if they gave me a chart and could read it. But I would say that it also can be, I would not say a handicap, but it's a step between what you have to absorb and the interpretation and play it.
Right.
Because you can only give so much information on paper or in writing. You know, music is all about, for me, it's metaphysical. It's, you feel it. You don't think, you don't think in the same intellectual way as you think to write a book or story, or it's a different process. And he had that talent, unbelievable, because indeed, it's one thing not to read music, but to be able to improvise such complex and write as a composer. The piece he wrote, where you know, it was like just linked completely to his type of playing, complex sometimes, but always very moving.
Yeah,
because
definitely.
then there is nothing in between. Once there is just the music right instantly. The note corresponds to the feeling
Right.
immediately.
Right. Now, I believe I read somewhere in his bio that he had played violin at some point. Did you talk to him about that?
Yeah, he started on violin.
Right.
He told me. And when I was recording Enigmatic Ocean, he wanted to be with me in the studio even when he didn't have to be there on certain days, just to hang and be there. And so I remember once I went to the bathroom, I was hearing violin. And he had taken my violin and was playing, and it sounded great. I said, my God, you play violin too. So I would say, probably his guitar phrasing was somewhat influenced by the violin, probably when he started.
Right.
That legato, which sounds like you're bowing the instrument, long notes, very sustained.
Right.
And in fact, he recorded, wasn't it with UK or no, one of his albums, one of his solo albums,
Right.
and he recorded violin on it.
Right. Yeah.
And so he said, I don't have that much technique. And okay, the bow, he didn't really practice the instrument much. He switched to guitar very quickly. So, but the left hand was moving like on the guitar. He could, the same concept in mind, it could have been one of the fantastic violinists.
Wow.
If he had wanted and continued.
Wow. Did you ever have the opportunity to perform with him live, or was mostly in the studio?
Well, I had asked him to tour after we released the album, and he came and started touring with us, but he was in a heavy emotional state at the time. I don't know what he was going through with his family, with his wife in England, but
Right.
he left after a few days. He went back home. He couldn't take it to be far away. So that's the kind of guy he was,
Right.
Totally. I don't know, guided by his emotions.
Of course, yeah. This would have been for Enigmatic Ocean.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
right.
But a few years ago, we talked, and I was talking to him about doing a collaborative project, a real collaboration. His compositions, mine, and maybe writing together. And unfortunately, that never happened. I mean, I must say I was so busy, one thing after another,
Right.
and I couldn't find the time, and living far apart geographically didn't help. So when I learned he passed away, a few weeks ago, it was such a shock.
Yeah, I'm sure. At least you got the revisit in that 2007 record, right? So that was nice.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I can at least, and his albums. In fact, Manifesto, that label from Los Angeles, released a box set of 12 CDs recently, and they had asked me to contribute a quote for the liner notes, and I did.
Nice.
And they are great quotes by Frank Zappa, Pat Metheny.
Right.
And so, but that was just a month maybe before he passed away.
You know what's great about those quotes is the fact that it was before he passed away, so they're, not that they wouldn't be insincere after he passed away, but, that he got to see them, it wasn't just a posthumous tribute, it was real while the man was still alive, and that makes it even more powerful.
Absolutely, you're right. It's not just trying to be nice,
right?
Because the guy passed away. No, it's that's he was a phenomenon.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. Any thoughts? One of the things about Allan is, I guess his commercial success combined with his, artistic milestone. His place in guitar history. He's the guy that changed the guitar forever, as the box set says, right? Any thoughts on his legacy, or what you would like, how you would like to see Allan remembered?
Well, I hope that future generations of guitarists will definitely not miss his work. I don't think so. I think he will remain quite a major figure. And of course, guitar being such a popular instrument and played by, there are great guitarists. So there are, I would say Allan was not the only one, but he was really only one of a kind. He was the only one to play like that. It was so original and so powerful and so rich harmonically that harmonically and rhythmically, it's so inventive that was what very impressed me always. And the sound and everything. The only thing is that because he was so raw and spontaneous and had no real musical education, it was not he could not really collaborate so easily, perhaps, with other musicians or bands, unless there was a strong affinity, like I did on some tunes. But maybe I admit that he might not have been the perfect guitarist for all the music I wrote. So I guess, there is a place in the world for everybody, the good ones especially, but he should really stay on a throne, on his own, for sure.
Joining me now is the great Jennifer Batten. Welcome, Jennifer.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. We went back and forth a little bit in terms of connecting to record this. I want to thank you sort of publicly for your patience, but I absolutely wanted to include you because I've heard you talk about Allan through the years, and I really, really wanted to get your voice in this tribute to him. So thank you for your patience and for joining me.
Sure. Glad it finally worked out.
Yeah, cool. Likewise, the thing I've been asking everybody sort of out of the gate is, how did Allan get on your radar? When did you first discover his music?
He was a fellow student at what was known at that time as the Guitar Institute of Technology. Now it's Musicians Institute.
Right.
Steve Lynch, he's the guy that got me into tapping, also turned me on to Soft Machine. I remember he played me a track or two, and it just hit me as something very fresh and different.
Right.
So I started following him from there, and I think that would have been 1978. I think that might have been before he even put out a solo record. But he kept popping back up in my radar, and I ended up buying several of his solo CDs and seeing him live several times as well. And it was just such a fresh, monstrous approach to music and guitar sound.
Right.
You know, it's kind of funny. When I was at the guitar school, I thought, well, God, all the sounds are taken. You know, Pat Metheny has a very unique sound. Robin Forrest got his. Van Halen's got his. And there's nothing left. And then Allan comes along, you know.
Right.
And has a completely new thing altogether with not only his sound, but his writing and his thinking were up in the stratosphere, leaving all of us plebeians below. Yeah.
Was it a mixture of technique and emotion? I've heard a lot of people talk about, you know, there's the technique thing, which is obviously, like you said, in the stratosphere, but there's also a level of, you know, his melodies and his emotion and his fluidness. Did that hook your ear right from the get-go as well?
Yeah, and when you say technique, I don't think of just chops. I just think of a very unusual way of sliding in and out of notes that I think he's the only guy out there that did it that way, where he had the strength in his hands to pull a string flat and then release it. You know, usually a guitar player can play a note and then bend sharp,
right.
But to pull it flat takes an extra kind of strength that I certainly can't do. So that's part of his signature sound. And for many years I thought it was all being done by the tremolo bar, but it's actually physically from his hands, most of it. So, yeah, and of course the emotions, the way he thinks is really phenomenal. I was on a flight with Chad Wackerman one time, and he said that one of the things about Allan's music, he said when you have a conversation, it's not squared off. Like, the words are not necessarily going to fit in 4 beats or 4 bars.
Right.
Straggle out a little bit. So that would explain a lot of his odd times. Is he's got a thought and it goes an extra beat, and so that's how he writes the tune instead of being confined in normal time signatures. I thought that was pretty freeing.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that has to be something of a game changer when you start to think of it that way. And he, you know, Allan couldn't read music. He was sort of self-taught. You know, maybe he benefited from not having those constraints, if you will.
I'm sure he did. You know, there are people that don't need lessons. They just have a natural, inherent affinity for music. Jeff Beck is one of those, that he was able to hear all kinds of different stuff on the radio and really absorb stuff and, in a way, turn it inside out and make it personal, have it come out again as a brand new personality. Somebody like me, I wouldn't be where I'm at if I didn't have lessons and have things torn apart and broken down and explained to me. So it's just all kinds of different players out there absorbing things in different ways.
Right. Do you remember the first time that you saw him perform?
Yeah, it would have to be in the early 80s. I was in a band in San Diego, and we went out as a band to see him. And then I remember another time I had knee surgery, so I couldn't get out to see him. So the band recorded a cassette tape of it for me. That's how long ago that was.
Right. Good old bootleg.
But yeah, I used to listen to that stuff over and over. Tokyo Dream is one of my favorites.
Gorgeous.
Metal Fatigue. Yeah.
Yeah.
That stuff's phenomenal.
How about in terms of like trying to emulate that? Because that's one of the things that I've heard from, all the players I've spoken to is, kind of a mixture of all at once, trying to emulate it, but then realizing it's inimitable in a way, right? Did you go through that as well?
Yeah, the only thing I really tried to emulate is that the sound of bending up into a note. And I ended up doing that a lot with the tremolo bar.
Right.
A lot of my playing still is with the tremolo bar in my hand, so I can slide in and out of notes that way. And I also use a whammy pedal to digitally manipulate it. But beyond that, I didn't even try.
Right.
Some people you just got to leave alone.
Right. That's great.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even understand and still don't understand a lot of his stuff. I mean, just normal scales and arpeggios are enough for most of us, and then he would go and invent his own. And that's just a step beyond for me. It just makes my hair smolder to think about.
That's a great way to say it, too. How about in terms of, well, you know what, you mentioned Jeff Beck, so that might be a good question for you specifically because, obviously both of these guys, influenced you in some degree. How would you compare Allan Holdsworth and Jeff Beck?
The things they would have in common is having a very personal, recognizable voice and being intensely creative in everything they do. Always stretching to hit new ground.
Right.
But I think Jeff's influences, which probably started with rockabilly kind of stuff. I don't listen to Allan's music and hear any of that. I don't hear his influences at all. I mean, because he was really deep into jazz, and he said he was trying to emulate saxophone, so he was coming from a whole other place that I didn't recognize.
Right. How about in terms of gear? Because you're a bit of a gearhead, if you will, and Allan was a tinkerer as well, right? How did you see him in that regard?
Well, he really stands out for the way he used delays with his clean sounds and his chords. It was very, very unique. I mean, that was as unique as his bending and his soloing. But I never tried to figure out what that was. I'm sure it's all on YouTube now.
Right.
He would use multiple delays and just really got into manipulating that for a super, super lush sound that almost sounded like a synthesizer.
Yeah.
I couldn't even tell you what gear he used. I didn't get that geeky into the stuff he was using.
Gotcha. So when you saw him in the '80s and stuff, and it sounds like you had mutual friends. Had you met him at that point, or did you ever meet him? I guess.
I met him years later. I met him here in Portland a couple of years ago. And also he came through several years before that. He came through with Terry Bozzio and Tony Levin.
Right.
They were doing an all improv show, and I met him that night. I'm not sure if I met him prior to that or not.
Did you have any fangirl moments where you said, where you kind of gushed over him, or did you have anything like that, or he was pretty chill?
He came off as very shy and uncomfortable. So I've known Terry for years, so I ended up talking more to Terry than Allan.
Right.
When somebody's uncomfortable, it's really hard to strike up a conversation. So I don't. I just turn the other way.
Right. Yeah, he's been sort of one of the things I've been getting from a lot of folks is that he was, a lot of humility, a lot of self-deprecation, in terms of his playing and things like that. So I was curious if you had any eyes on that, any personal experience in seeing anything like that.
Just from what I've read.
Right.
I mean, just the fact that he didn't realize how good he was is kind of stunning. And it also shows you that he's always stretching, always had a moving goal, like most of us do. You know, I want to be there, and once you're there, you don't realize it because your goals have already gone way beyond where you thought previously.
Yeah, certainly always chasing that creative muse, you know. He certainly did have that. I guess kind of the closing thing I've been asking folks is, what would you like to see how he'd be remembered going forward?
Rather than how I'd want to see him remembered is I'd want to see him not forgotten. Because he was a niche player. I mean, he was so advanced that he was never in the mainstream.
Right.
And in general, instrumental music is not in the mainstream, and he's off in one corner of that. So I just hope the guitar players coming up are at least aware of who he is and at least listen to a few records, because he put out so much stuff. He was so prolific. It's not hard to find his stuff out there.
Joining me now is the great Ty Tabor of King's X and the Jelly Jam. How you doing, Ty?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time to chat about Mr. Holdsworth. One of the things that I've been doing with these episodes is finding people that, people that he worked with, people that he influenced, and somewhere along the line I saw a list that you had put together where, you identified one of his records as one of the most influential guitar records or something to that effect. So I absolutely wanted to have you talk about Allan Holdsworth. But before we get into that, the very first question I've been asking everybody is, essentially, and maybe it's even the same question in your case, is essentially how did Allan get on your radar? How did you first discover this guy and his work?
It was back in the old days of King's X, years before we had a record deal. This was during the time when we were traveling around a good chunk of the country in this old emergency vehicle called Trucks. It said Chuck's Truck Service on the side of it, and that was something we lived in for a long time. Actually, we put 2 engines in it, but possibly 3. I mean, we literally lived in it and drove all over the country. And in those days, in the early 80s, we were playing clubs that were really big clubs.
Right.
And in those days, believe it or not, clubs didn't have PAs or stage, stuff like lights built in. They just had a stage, and the band was expected to bring the show.
Right.
So that was why we traveled in this big truck. We had a huge light show and carried our own PA and everything. So what that meant was, as we went town to town, and we were there for hours before each show we did, setting up our own gear, setting up the PA, and PA was the first thing to go up before we worried about stage.
Right.
And so music would start up first, and there was this long period of time there where Doug was just really losing it over U2 in super early days, and
Right.
And so he was just playing it constantly, and so one day after just several days of nonstop U2, we set up the PA, and I go up on stage. I'm getting ready to hook up my guitar and stuff, and get everything situated. And all of a sudden, this music comes over the PA, and it just immediately, was something really woke me up, and I was just absolutely transfixed by it. And when it got to just as far as the guitar tone, it was just everything I wanted to hear. It was just this beautiful, heavy tone, but very articulate, and just its own expression,
Right.
and like nothing I'd ever heard before. And it really freaked me out.
Wow.
I can remember just being stunned, just jaw dropping, and then it got to the first solo, and then the second solo, and these weird vibrato things of almost like the guitar is crying, and yet it's beautifully melodic and like nothing I'd ever heard before. Literally, just nothing I'd ever heard before. It was on its own, and just I know that it messed me up so bad that it literally made me feel like, why should I play guitar?
Wow.
What do I have to offer after hearing that?
And this is a night. And you're about to go on, right?
Yeah, well, it was a few hours before going on, because it was still in the middle of the day while we're setting up and everything. But yeah, it excited me. It woke me up. It made me realize there's an infinite universe of possibility out there. If someone can express themselves this way and it be so uniquely themselves, then the whole world is open. on guitar all of a sudden. Everything I'd thought about guitar before that moment was over. It was a different world, and I even tried emulating him quite a bit during that time, and learning some of that stuff. And then I found myself realizing, well, I'm not Holdsworth, but boy, he gave me the greatest gift of all, which was permission to express however the heck I want to. And so it was completely life-changing. And I have a couple of those life-changing moments, but that was the first one. That was where I first heard him, and
Wow.
and literally everything in my life about guitar changed that day.
And what was it? The UK record? Is that the one?
Yeah, it was the first day, and just everything on it's masterful. Matter of fact, I put it on and played it here about an hour ago, just to hear it and remember and kind of relive it. And it was a lot of fun. Just amazing guitar playing.
Wow. Were there, and this is the time before, YouTube and, instructional videos and all that kind of stuff. So you almost have to figure this stuff out by ear if you could figure it out. So, a few of the other folks I've been talking to, they kind of said, something to the effect of, if you hear a guy like Yngwie Malmsteen play super quick, you can kind of slow it down and your ear can kind of hear what's going on. But with a dude like Holdsworth, you couldn't quite do that. Did you have any experience like that when you heard that? Like how to, aside from inspiration, which is absolutely incredible, like technically speaking, I imagine you tried to figure out, well, what is this guy doing?
Yeah, I attempted to, and was successful with just one little phrase here or there, or one vibrato or something here or there. But I was able to recognize that with every single note he played, there was care, there was expression, there was never just a note played. There's always something in the hand expressing that note. And so he had such a fluid way of connecting things like no one else. And it was all the way each individual note expressed, which is his technique and heart on 11. He had both, and which is that unique thing, because I don't care about how great a guitar player is unless it moves me. And the thing is, he tugged from the heart with things that were technically ridiculous, but that wasn't the purpose. It came from the heart. He was expressing something. And so every little note, every little thing had that in it, and that's what makes him completely unique and different from anyone else. He just owned himself in his expression.
Yeah. How about in terms of playing with others? Because he was often a trio, and obviously you've made a lot of work in working in trios. Anything you picked up from him in terms of interaction with other guys in your band? Did it influence that at all?
Not really. When I watch him, like speaking of good trio performances, there was that DVD of Live in Japan, from the Road Games era, and I believe it was released as I.O.U. Live in the U.S.
Right.
Possibly. But anyway, I saw a video, a VHS of it, and a lot of times, it would just be the three players on stage doing their thing during that performance. A whole lot of performances that way, and that was another one of those performances that was that second time where yet another level of understanding or awareness of the ridiculousness of all of his wonderful expressions were in that particular concert. It's my personal favorite recording of anything ever that was captured of him that I've ever heard, including all albums, everything. That and I, from what I once heard, he wasn't particularly, real happy with that. But there's something in that performance that's just like it captured the magic. And like on the song White Lines, there's a solo that's so different than the album, and at one point even goes into extremely melodic moments. And it was some of the stuff, particularly in that solo, but his expression throughout that entire album was the second time where once again another level of respect and awe and everything. But that's how it affected me when I heard him play. When those guys were so beyond what I felt my ability to even be able to be a part of, I just would always listen in awe, because Chad was on drums. I mean, the way they would be just absolutely going into crazy off-time stuff and then coming right back together perfectly, to where its fusion is crazy and yet it's groove, with a feel, and something that is missing in so much of that kind of music to me. And one of the reasons I love that performance, and one of the reasons I love Allan so much, like I said, once again, he had both. He had both sides of the brain.
Yeah, most certainly. Did you ever have an opportunity to see him live or meet him or anything like that?
I was able to meet him just once, very briefly, at NAMM. We were all hanging out at this Seymour Duncan thing, which is, happens every year.
Right.
And it was in this kind of big room with a lot of different musicians and players. And I believe Derek St. Holmes or Brad Whitford introduced me. I actually can't remember, but I was talking with both of those guys that night, and I realized that they were talking with Allan, and I realized Allan was there, first of all, and I was like, oh, wow, Allan Holdsworth is here. Are you kidding me?
Right.
And so I remember, I can't remember if it was Brad or Derek, but one of them I just said, oh, man, you've got to introduce me to Allan, please. And so he did, and I was, I kept it very brief and got out of his way, but I was just so honored to actually get to meet him. It was ridiculous. I was total fanboy.
Yeah. In a situation like that, it's probably somewhat challenging sometimes to not just, sort of regurgitate all these questions and praise. And, I guess one of the things that I've been hearing a lot from people talking about Allan was, that he was very self-deprecating and humble. I don't know if you had any of that when you interacted with him, but...
Well, he seemed very, he seemed to have a lot of humility.
Right. Right. That's a good way to phrase it. How about in the landscape of your influences, right? You have, obviously have a lot of variety in your playing, and a lot of influences, a lot of variety in your influences, Kiss, Brian May, Rush, et cetera, right? What is it about Allan that makes him unique?
Well, he came from a different universe. While I really did love everyone you just mentioned and influenced by all of the above, and I'm certainly, play a more straight ahead rock kind of thing than the world that Allan comes from. He just had this universe inside of him when he wrote stuff that came from somewhere that I didn't understand, that I just, had no way to be thinking of myself. And
right.
So it was always just, he was always like the unicorn or something that is the impossibility, the thing that you just are in awe of, that you can't be, so you don't try, you after that first, initial attempting to try to play those things that you love so much, you realize you can't be him, and so you leave him alone as that unicorn. And so I still to this day, I'm just always in awe when I listen. It's just like a separate issue,
Yeah, that's great. And I guess the final thing I've been asking everybody is, a guy like this, he's like an Einstein, he's like a Tesla, right? What would you hope the legacy of Allan Holdsworth would be going forward?
I hope that other guitar players continue to get what I and most other guitarists I know get from him. I hope that just continues. I know it will. I mean, when that legacy and its effect is just going to live on, and I can't wait for younger players who have a different body they have drawn from to become the players they are. I can't wait to hear what they do when they hear Allan for the first time and get their mind blown and see where they can go. I just hope that just keeps going, and I'm sure it will.
Thanks again for listening to this tribute to remembering Allan Holdsworth. If you haven't, please go check out the other two parts of this trilogy. Hopefully you'll enjoy them as much as I enjoyed recording them. You can find more Allan Holdsworth. I guess the legacy question is, buy his music, support his music, keep his work rippling forward. So go pick up that Holdsworth disc that you don't have. Go pick up the new box set that they released. Tell a friend, share with a friend. If you know someone that's picking up a guitar, expose them to whatever it was about Holdsworth that hooked your ear. Pay it forward. So, hopefully his impact will continue to resonate, as I'm sure it will. And you can find more Pods and Sods at podsodcast.com. You can also find us on Facebook, facebook.com/podssods. On our website, podsodcast.com, there's tons of episodes, hundreds. They're all tagged, so there's all kinds of variety on there, interviews, track-by-track album reviews, just all kinds of fun music geekery. So hopefully you'll go check that out as well. And once again, I thank you for listening, and I sincerely thank everyone that joined me in these tribute episodes. It really meant a lot for me to record them, and in fact, I may do a few more. Unfortunately, we have a lot of losses lately, so I may do some more of these for some other artists that we're losing here. So anyway, having said all that, I will close with some words of wisdom that I always close with from Mr. Bill Hicks. Thank you.
The world is like a ride at an amusement park, and when you choose to go on it, you think it's real, because that's how powerful our minds are. And the ride goes up and down and round and round. It has thrills and chills, and it's very brightly colored, and it's very loud, and it's fun for a while. Some people have been on the ride for a long time, and they begin to question, is this real, or is this just a ride? And other people have remembered, and they come back to us, and they say, hey, don't worry, don't be afraid, ever, because this is just a ride. And we kill those people. Shut him up. We have a lot invested in this ride. Shut him up. Look at my furrows of worry. Look at my big bank account and my family. This has to be real. It's just a ride. But we always kill those good guys who try and tell us that. You ever notice that? And let the demons run amok? But it doesn't matter, because it's just a ride. And we can change it anytime we want. It's only a choice. No effort, no work, no job, no savings of money. A choice right now between fear and love. The eyes of fear want you to put bigger locks on your door, buy guns, close yourself off. The eyes of love instead see all of us as one. Here's what we can do to change the world right now to a better ride. Take all that money we spend on weapons and defense each year and instead spend it feeding, clothing, and educating the poor of the world, which it would many times over, not one human being excluded, and we can explore space together, both inner and outer, forever in peace.